The year was 1874, when the rugged Arizona Territory stood as America's final untamed frontier, a merciless landscape where the line between life and death was as thin as the desert air. Between sun-scorched plains and towering mesas, where summer, heat-blistered skin, and winter nights froze to the bone, survival demanded more than mere strength. It required understanding the land's harsh whispers. This is the extraordinary story of Clara Emerson, a young frontier girl born without the ability to speak, and Nahuel, an Apache medicine man who recognized in her silence not an absence, but a presence, a remarkable gift for communicating with the natural world that would ultimately save an entire valley from devastation. Clara Emerson entered the world during the worst drought Copper Canyon had seen in 40 years. Her birth, on a night when dust devils danced across the parched landscape like vengeful spirits, was marked by two extraordinary circumstances: her mother's death moments after bringing her into the world, and Clara's complete and utter silence. No birth cry announced her arrival, no infantile wails followed in the days and weeks to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "It ain't natural," whispered Mabel Thornton, the midwife who had delivered 3 generations of Copper Canyon residents. "A baby that don't cry is touched by something unwholesome. Mark my words." James Emerson, a silver prospector turned struggling cattle rancher, found himself suddenly widowed with a silent infant daughter that the town viewed with increasing suspicion. In his grief, he withdrew to his small ranch at the canyon's edge, employing Socorro, an elderly Mexican woman who had once worked for his wife's family, to help care for the strange, silent child. "La Niña speaks with her eyes," Socorro would tell James when he expressed worry over his daughter's condition. "Some souls are too full for words. They must find other ways to let their spirits flow." As Clara grew from infant to child, her silence remained absolute. No childish babble, no attempted words, no cries of pain when she fell or shouts of joy when she played. Yet to those who paid attention, primarily her father and Socorro, it became clear that Clara's silence masked extraordinary awareness. Her deep brown eyes missed nothing: the subtle changes in plant life before storms arrived, the barely perceptible shifts in animal behavior that signaled danger, the minute expressions that crossed people's faces, revealing thoughts they believed hidden. By her 8th year, Clara had developed a sophisticated system of gestures to communicate with her father and Socorro. More remarkable was her connection to the natural world around her. Plants flourished under her care in ways that defied explanation, especially in their drought-stricken region. She could locate hidden water sources that others walked past without noticing. Animals approached her without fear, often seeming to communicate distress or injury that she somehow understood and addressed. "She is blessed, not cursed," Socorro insisted when James voiced concerns about his daughter's future in a world that valued spoken communication. "The Creator gives different gifts to different souls. Clara's gift is to hear what the earth whispers." James nodded, love for his daughter evident in his weather-beaten face, though worry creased his brow. But the town grows more suspicious. Reverend Stanley refused to let her join the children's Bible study last Sunday, said her silence was unnatural and disturbing to the others. Indeed, as Copper Canyon struggled through its 5th consecutive year of drought, as cattle withered and crops failed, as the silver mines yielded less and the town's prosperity dwindled, the community's attitude toward the silent girl hardened. Clara's differences, once merely peculiar, became ominous in a community desperate to explain their misfortunes. It was Clara's 12th birthday when the situation reached its breaking point. James had taken her into town for supplies, a rare occurrence as he usually left her at the ranch to avoid the stares and whispers. They needed supplies badly enough to risk the journey together: flour, salt, ammunition, and tools to repair the windmill that had finally given up after years of drawing from the increasingly depleted water table. William Thornton, eldest son of the midwife who had first pronounced Clara unwholesome, now served as both mayor and owner of the general store. His face hardened when he saw James enter with Clara trailing behind. "Emerson," he acknowledged curtly, eyes narrowing as they fell on Clara. "Surprised you brought her to town, given the circumstances." "What circumstances would those be, Thornton?" James asked, his voice carrying the dangerous edge of a man who had spent decades in frontier territories where trouble rarely announced itself politely. "The council meeting last night," Thornton replied, straightening behind his counter. "Thought word might have reached you by now. We've been discussing the drought, reasons for its solutions." James began selecting items from his list, placing them on the counter with deliberate control. Didn't know the town council had authority over rainfall these days. Several customers browsing the store edged closer, sensing confrontation. Clara, acutely aware of the rising tension, kept her eyes lowered, one hand clutching the back of her father's worn leather vest. "When misfortune plagues a community this long," Thornton continued, "wise folks look for the cause. Sometimes the Lord sends trials to test our faith. Other times," his gaze settled meaningfully on Clara, "he's pointing to something that ain't right among us." James's hand stilled over the ammunition box he'd been reaching for. "Speak plain, Thornton. You suggesting my daughter has something to do with the drought?" Reverend Stanley stepped forward from where he'd been examining bolts of cloth with his wife. His gaunt frame and severe expression had frightened Clara since earliest childhood, and she pressed herself closer to her father's side. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Emerson," the Reverend intoned, "but Scripture teaches us to recognize signs and portents. A child born without God's gift of speech, born as her mother died, born as the rain ceased. These are not coincidences. To God-fearing people," James turned slowly to face the Reverend, his voice dangerously quiet, "you're standing in a store, Stanley, not your pulpit. Be careful what you're preaching." Martha Wilson, whose husband ran the failing sawmill at the canyon's edge, spoke up from near the dry goods. "It ain't just idle talk, James. My Joseph was up at your place last month helping with that well. He saw things, unnatural things." Her voice dropped to a theatrical whisper. "Said your girl was touching dead plants and they turned green again. Said she was whispering to your horses without making a sound, and they followed her commands." Clara tugged urgently at her father's vest, her hands forming the gesture they used at home for "let's go." She could feel the hostility building in the store, like the pressure before a thunderstorm, dangerous and electric. "My daughter works hard and has a way with growing things," James replied evenly. "Something this town could use more of, not fear." "The council voted Emerson," Thornton said, no longer bothering to maintain a pretense of civility. "We're God-fearing people trying to survive. The drought's killed half the cattle in the territory. The mines are drying up. Families are leaving. Every month. We can't ignore signs the Almighty is sending. What exactly did this council vote on?" James demanded, his hand now resting near the revolver at his hip. Reverend Stanley stepped forward. "For the good of Copper Canyon, we've determined that your daughter should be examined by specialists at the Territorial Asylum in Tucson. If she's merely simple-minded, they can provide appropriate care. If there's something more sinister at work—" He made a vague gesture that might have been a cross. "They have experience with such matters as well." The tension in the store crackled like desert lightning. Clara's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it, though no sound escaped her lips. She had understood far more than the adults realized. The Territorial Asylum. She had heard whispers about that place. People went in, but they rarely came out. "You'll take my daughter from my home when I'm dead and buried," James said quietly, his hand now resting openly on his revolver. Thornton sighed as if disappointed by this response. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. We expected you might feel that way, which is why we've already sent for federal marshals. They'll be here by week's end with proper documentation. The territorial governor takes the matter of public safety seriously, Emerson. Public safety? James's voice rose for the first time. She's a 12-year-old girl who can't speak, who makes dead things live, Martha Wilson hissed. Who can control animals with her mind? Who was born as the rains died? The territory's dying, James. Our children are hungry. We need the rains back. Clara tugged harder at her father's vest, her eyes wide with fear and pleading. She could see the calculations running behind his eyes. He was outnumbered, the town had turned, and legal authority was being summoned against them. "We're leaving," James announced abruptly, abandoning their supplies on the counter. "Send your bill to the ranch." "The marshals will come, Emerson," Thornton called after them as they pushed through the store's door. "The council's unanimous. The girl needs to be examined for all our sakes." Back at their ranch that evening, James moved with grim efficiency, packing essentials into saddlebags while Socorro prepared travel food. Clara sat at the rough-hewn table, her hands moving rapidly in their private language. "They blame me for the drought," her gesture said. "They're afraid of me." "People fear what they don't understand," Socorro replied, her gnarled hands momentarily stilling over the cornbread she was wrapping. "And fear makes them cruel, makes them look for simple answers to difficult problems." James returned from the back room with his rifle and a small leather pouch of silver coins, their meager savings. "Clara will ride north with me tonight," he told Socorro. "My brother's ranch near Flagstaff. They won't look for us there." Socorro nodded, her lined face solemn. "What of the marshals? They will come and find only an old Mexican woman." "Tell them we headed south toward Tucson," James replied. "By the time they realize the truth, we'll be established elsewhere. I'll send for you when it's safe." Clara's hands moved again, her eyes filling with tears. "This is our home, the garden, the horses." James knelt before his daughter, taking her small hands in his calloused ones. "Home is where we're safe, Clara. These people have let fear poison their minds. We'll build a new home where you won't be blamed for things beyond anyone's control." That night, as James made final preparations for their journey, Clara slipped away from the ranch house, not to run, she would never abandon her father, but to visit her special place one last time. A small hidden canyon accessible through a narrow cleft in the rocks, where a tiny spring created an oasis of green even in the worst of the drought years. Here she had cultivated her own secret garden of medicinal herbs, plants that Socorro had taught her to identify and use for healing. The quarter moon provided just enough light for Clara to find her path to the hidden canyon. She moved with the confidence of someone traversing deeply familiar territory, her footsteps silent on the rocky ground. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint moisture of the spring that bubbled up from some deep underground source. Clara knelt beside her garden, her fingers gently touching each plant in a gesture of farewell. These plants had been her companions, responding to her care in ways that sometimes startled even Socorro. The old woman claimed that Clara could hear the plants speaking. And while Clara didn't understand it that way herself, she knew she could sense things about them, their thirst, their health, what they needed to thrive in this harsh environment. A slight rustling from the canyon's edge made her freeze. Years of frontier life had taught her to recognize potential danger. Slowly, she turned toward the sound, expecting perhaps a coyote or javelina drawn to the water source. Instead, she found herself looking at a man, tall, straight-backed, with the distinctive features of the Apache people. He wore a blend of traditional dress and practical frontier clothing and carried no visible weapon, though Clara knew that meant little. The Apache were legendary for their ability to conceal numerous weapons about their person. They regarded each other in silence. For a long moment, Clara's heart pounded, but she showed no outward sign of fear. The local Apache bands had maintained an uneasy peace with the settlers for nearly a decade, but isolated encounters could still be dangerous, especially for a young girl alone. 2. Her surprise, the man made a gesture she recognized, the Apache sign for peace, then another that roughly translated to "no fear intended." Clara hesitated, then responded with the same signs. She had learned some of the hand language used between different Apache bands from Socorro, whose late husband had traded with them regularly before the tensions worsened. The man's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly surprised that this young white girl knew any Apache signs. He moved closer, still maintaining a respectful distance, and gestured to her garden. "These are medicine plants," he signed. "You grow them well in dry times." Clara nodded, then signed back carefully. "I come to say goodbye to them. We must leave tomorrow." "Why?" The simple question, carried by a tilt of his head and quick hand movement. Clara considered how to explain the complexity of her situation through limited sign language. Finally, she pointed to her throat, then her mouth, and shook her head. "No." "In voice," she signed. "Town people afraid. Say I bring the drought." The man studied her with penetrating dark eyes that missed nothing. Then, to Clara's astonishment, he knelt beside her garden and gently touched a struggling sage plant she'd been trying to save for weeks. His hand movements were precise, almost ceremonial, as he packed a small amount of damp soil more securely. "Around its roots, plants speak without sound," he signed. "Stones speak without sound. Sky speaks without sound." He pointed to Clara. "You listen well." The simple observation, the recognition of her silence, not as a lack, but as a different form of communication, brought unexpected tears to Clara's eyes. This stranger had understood in moments what her entire community had failed to grasp in 12 years. The man reached into a pouch at his waist and removed something wrapped in a scrap of leather. Carefully unwrapping it, he revealed a small stone carving of a bear, polished to a soft sheen from handling. "I am Nahuel," he signed, then pointed to the bear carving. "Medicine man of the bear clan. I watch this place many moons. Watch you speak to plants." He held the carving out to her. "This stone has power, helps one who listens." Clara hesitated, aware of the significant gift being offered. Cultural barriers between settlers and Apache were rarely crossed with such gestures. Slowly she accepted the small carving, feeling its surprising warmth against her palm. "Clara," she signed her name. "Thank you." Suddenly, a distant call broke the night's silence. Her father's voice, tinged with panic at finding her, missing so close to their departure. Clara turned toward the sound, then back to Nahuel, her hands moving quickly. "I must go. My father worries." Nahuel nodded, then made one final series of signs before melting back into the shadows with remarkable stealth. "The drought has purpose. Listen to what it teaches. When time comes, find Bear Clan beyond the 3 mesas." Clara clutched the stone carving tightly as she hurried back toward the ranch house, her mind spinning with the strange encounter. Unlike the townspeople who saw only what was missing in her, this Apache medicine man had seen something present, a skill, a way of understanding that he considered valuable. She found her father at the edge of their property, rifle in hand, face taut with worry. When she emerged from the darkness, his expression transformed from fear to relief, then quickly to stern admonishment. "Clara! Where were you? We're leaving within the hour. It's dangerous to—" She cut off his scolding with urgent hand gestures, trying to explain her encounter, to show him the stone bear, to convey the strange message about the drought having purpose. But James Emerson, practical man of the frontier, saw only fantasy in his daughter's excited communication. "Clara, stop. We don't have time for imagination. The marshals could arrive by tomorrow afternoon if they rode hard from Tucson. We need to be well away by dawn." Clara's hands stilled, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Even her father, who loved her more than anyone, couldn't truly see what she was trying to tell him. The stone bear remained hidden in her pocket as they mounted their horses and rode away from the only home she had ever known, headed north under cover of darkness. What Clara couldn't know as they left Copper Canyon behind was that fate had already set her on a collision course with her destiny, that the drought, her silence, the stone bear, and the Apache medicine man were all pieces of a larger pattern that would eventually reveal itself in ways no one in Copper Canyon could possibly imagine. The gift that had made her an outcast among her own people would soon become the very thing that could save them all, if only they could recognize it in time. The journey north proved more treacherous than James Emerson had anticipated. What should have been a 4-day ride to his brother's ranch stretched into 9 days of hardship that tested both father and daughter to their limits. 3 days after leaving Copper Canyon, their horses threw shoes on the unforgiving rocky terrain, forcing them to proceed on foot while leading the animals carefully over sharp-edged stones. Then came the dust storm, a howling wall of red earth that drove them to shelter in a shallow cave for 2 days, rationing their dwindling water supplies as fine desert grit found its way into food, clothing, and lungs. Through it all, Clara maintained a stoic silence that went beyond her usual inability to speak. The small stone bear carving never left her possession, often clutched tightly in her palm as they navigated the harsh landscape. James noticed this new talisman, but said nothing, assuming it was some trinket she had kept from their ranch. Perhaps something Socorro had given her. He was too preoccupied with their survival to question where it had come from, or why it seemed to provide his daughter with unusual comfort. On the 9th morning, as they crested a ridge that should have provided their first view of the San Francisco peaks near Flagstaff, James stopped abruptly, his weathered face draining of color. Clara followed his gaze and felt her stomach twist. With dread, instead of the expected mountain range, they saw only more desert stretching endlessly before them, shimmering in the early morning heat. "We're off course," James muttered, more to himself than to Clara. He squinted at the sun, then fumbled for his compass, shaking it with growing desperation when the needle swung erratically. Damn dust storm must have damaged it. Or maybe that iron deposit we passed yesterday. Clara tugged at his sleeve, making the gesture they used for water. Their canteens held barely enough for another day, and the horses were showing signs of dangerous dehydration. James surveyed the landscape, his expression grim beneath his sun-blistered face. "We need to find water today, or we won't make it to anywhere." He pointed to a distant line of darker vegetation, barely visible on the horizon. "That might be a wash or a creek bed. Could be dry, but it's our best chance." They set out toward the distant green smudge, the horses moving with the sluggish resignation of animals pushed beyond endurance. The morning heat built quickly into the familiar crushing weight of midday in the Arizona desert. By noon, James was swaying slightly in his gait, his cracked lips moving in silent calculations of distance and survival odds. Clara, though smaller and seemingly more vulnerable, maintained a steadier pace. Something about the stone bear in her hand seemed to lend her strength that defied her size and the harsh conditions. As she walked, she found herself increasingly aware of subtle changes in the landscape. The way certain insects moved, the patterns of heat rising from different types of rock, the almost imperceptible differences in vegetation that told stories about what lay beneath the surface. Suddenly, Clara stopped, her attention caught by a small desert tortoise crossing their path. The ancient creature paused as well, its wrinkled head extending cautiously from its protective shell to regard the human intruders. Clara knelt, ignoring her father's impatient urging to continue, and watched the tortoise with complete focus. To James's astonishment, the tortoise approached his daughter rather than retreating into its shell. Clara extended her hand, the one not holding the bear carving, and the tortoise pressed its head against her palm in a gesture that seemed almost like communication. After a moment, Clara stood and tugged urgently at her father's sun-faded shirt, pointing decisively away from the direction they had been heading, toward a rockier section of terrain that showed no obvious promise of water. "Clara, no," James said firmly, his parched voice cracking. "The vegetation line is our best chance." Clara's gestures became more insistent. She pointed repeatedly at the tortoise, which had begun moving in the direction she indicated, then mimicked drinking water. "You think the tortoise is leading us to water?" James asked, struggling between his rational mind that dismissed such a notion and his desperate circumstances that demanded consideration of any possibility. Clara nodded emphatically, already starting in the new direction, following the unhurried pace of the tortoise. James hesitated, looked back at the distant vegetation line they had been targeting, then at his determined daughter. With a sigh that spoke volumes about their dire situation, he followed her lead, bringing the tired horses. With him, they followed the tortoise for nearly an hour, weaving between rocky outcroppings that grew increasingly steep and dramatic. James's doubt mounted with each step, but Clara moved with the certainty of someone following explicit directions rather than a desert tortoise. The tortoise led them to a narrow defile between two towering red rock formations, barely wide enough for the horses to pass through. As they emerged on the other side, James stopped in stunned disbelief. Before them lay a small hidden canyon, invisible from the surrounding desert, its bottom cradling a modest but unmistakably wet oasis centered around a clear spring bubbling. Up from between rocks, "My God," James whispered, his voice barely audible from thirst and shock. "How did you—" But Clara was already leading the horses to water, her focus entirely on ensuring the animals drank slowly enough to avoid colic. The tortoise, its unlikely mission apparently completed, retreated to the shade of a mesquite tree and watched the proceedings with ancient, unreadable eyes. After they had quenched their thirst and refilled their canteens, James studied his daughter with new awareness. "That tortoise, it showed you this place somehow?" Clara's hands moved in their private sign language, attempting to explain something more complex than their limited system could easily convey. She pointed to her ears, then around at the canyon, then to the tortoise, and finally to the stone bear she still clutched. "You heard something," James guessed, struggling to understand. "The bear statue helped you hear the tortoise." Clara shook her head in frustration, then tried again with different gestures. She pointed to herself, then made wave-like motions with her hands, then indicated the tortoise and the surrounding landscape. James sighed and sat heavily on a rock, exhaustion claiming him now that the immediate crisis had passed. "I don't understand, Clara, but I'm grateful whatever it was. You saved our lives today." As twilight deepened the shadows in their hidden sanctuary, Clara sat apart from her sleeping father, the stone bear balanced on her open palm. The day's events had awakened something inside her, a sense of connection to the world around her that went beyond her already unusual awareness of plants and animals. The tortoise hadn't spoken to her, not in any way her father might understand, as language, but she had felt its knowledge of this place, its certainty about the hidden water, as clearly as if it had been whispered directly into her mind. The bear carving seemed to amplify this sensitivity. When she held it, the subtle energies of the desert, the slow movement of water deep underground, the ancient memories held in stone, the silent communication between living things, became perceptible in ways she couldn't begin to explain with gestures or signs. A soft sound pulled Clara from her reverie. She turned to find the tortoise had approached again, its presence somehow conveying a sense of intentional communication rather than random animal movement. Behind it, emerging from the deepening shadows at the canyon's edge, came a familiar figure, Nahuel, the Apache medicine man. Clara's immediate instinct was to wake her father, but something held her back. James Emerson, for all his love and protection, saw the world through eyes trained to distrust what they couldn't categorize. His reaction to finding an Apache man in their camp would not be peaceful questioning. Nahuel approached slowly, making the sign for peace as he had at their first meeting. His gaze took in James's sleeping form, then returned to Clara with a questioning tilt of his head. "Your father is sick," he signed. Not really a question. Clara nodded. The past days had taken a heavier toll on James than he wanted to admit. Even in sleep, his breathing was labored, and fever had begun to flush his sunburned face. "Desert sickness," Nahuel signed. "Needs medicine." Clara hesitated, torn between waking her father and accepting help she knew he would refuse out of ingrained suspicion. Before she could decide, Nahuel made another series of signs. "I follow," he explained. "Many days. Make sure bare stone finds right hands." Clara's eyes widened in surprise, her fingers automatically tightening around the carving. She gestured toward the tortoise, then the hidden spring, questioning. Nahuel's face remained impassive, but something like approval flickered in his dark eyes. "You begin to hear," he confirmed. "Stone helps. But gift was already in you." He moved closer, kneeling to examine James without touching him. After careful observation, he reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew a small bundle of dried plants. Through signs, he instructed Clara to steep these in hot water and have her father drink the resulting tea by morning. "Why help us?" Clara signed, the blunt question reflecting both gratitude and wariness. Nahuel studied her for a long moment before responding, his hands moving in more complex patterns than before, forcing Clara to concentrate to follow his meaning. Long ago, medicine people of all tribes could hear Earth's voice. Apache, Navajo, even white settlers who first came. Now most forget how to listen. Drought comes because people forget. Earth speaks louder when not heard. "You hear still. Important," he pointed to the stone bear. "This belonged to my teacher. Before him, his teacher. Bears dig for water even in driest times. Find what is hidden. You are like bear now." Clara looked down at the carving with new appreciation for its significance. When she looked up to thank Nahuel, the medicine man had already retreated to the shadows as silently as he had appeared. Only the small bundle of medicinal herbs and the tortoise, still regarding her with ancient patience, confirmed that the encounter had been real and not a product of exhaustion. By morning, James's fever had broken after drinking the bitter tea. Clara prepared. His suspicious questions about where she had found the medicinal plants were met with gestures, indicating she had discovered them growing near the spring. Not entirely untrue, though deliberately incomplete. They rested for 2 days in the hidden canyon, regaining strength and allowing the horses to recover. During this time, Clara explored the small oasis with growing awareness, her senses sharpened by the stone bear's mysterious influence. She discovered 3 more medicinal plants she recognized from Socorro's teachings, each one surprisingly vibrant despite the surrounding desert's parched condition. More startling were the faint pictographs she found etched into a sheltered rock face. Ancient images depicting water flowing from stone, animals gathering at a spring, and human figures with their hands raised toward the sky in what might have been supplication or celebration. One figure stood apart from the others, smaller but central to the scene, with wavy lines emanating from its head in a pattern that suggested either significance or special awareness. On the morning of their departure, Clara returned to these, their pictographs alone. Standing before the small central figure with its radiating lines, she felt a strange resonance, as if something in the ancient depiction recognized and acknowledged her presence. Acting on impulse that felt more like responding to an unheard summons, she pressed her palm against the figure, the stone bear clutched in her other hand. A sensation like gentle electric current traveled up her arm, bringing with it fragments of impressions too rapid and formless to be called images, the taste of rain on dust, the feeling of roots pushing through soil toward water, the patient persistence of stone wearing away beneath decades of wind and weather. Then, clearer than these sensory fragments, came a sense of direction. North and west, beyond three distinctive mesa formations where mountains created their own weather and forests still thrived. The Bear Clan, Nahuel's people, the destination. He had signed to her during their first meeting. When Clara rejoined her father at their small camp, she found him studying a rough map he had sketched in the dirt with a stick, his face troubled. "We're still 3 days from Flagstaff if we push hard," he said, not looking up as she approached. "But there's another problem. I've been thinking about those marshals. If they're determined enough to follow, my brother's ranch will be the first place they look." He ran a hand through his graying hair. "Maybe we should head west instead, toward California. Harder journey, but better chance of disappearing." Clara knelt beside the crude map, studying it intently. Then, with deliberate movements, she traced a new route, north and west, deviating from both James's original plan and his new California suggestion. Her finger stopped pointedly at the rough indication of a mountain range. James frowned. "That's Apache territory, Clara, the mountains north of the Painted Desert. Nothing there but trouble for people like us." Clara's hands flew in urgent signs, trying to convey what she couldn't explain in words. The hidden oasis that had saved them, the medicine that had cured his fever, the pictograph's silent message, and the pull she felt toward the mountains where Nahuel's people dwelled. Slow. "Oh, down," James interrupted, unable to follow her rapid gestures. "What's gotten into you? We can't just ride into Apache land and expect welcome. Even with the peace treaties, lone settlers are asking for trouble." Clara's frustration mounted as the familiar barrier of communication rose between them. How could she explain what she herself only partially understood? That the drought had meaning beyond mere absence of rain. That she was being drawn toward something important. That the Apache medicine man had recognized what her own people could not see in her. In desperation, she pulled out the stone bear carving, pressing it into her father's palm and closing his fingers around it, willing him to feel what she had, felt the connection to something larger than themselves. James examined the carving with obvious confusion. "Where did you get this, Clara? It's clearly Apache work." His expression darkened with sudden suspicion. "Have you been in contact with them? Is that how you found this canyon?" Clara's hands moved in frantic explanation, describing Nahuel, their meetings, his help. James's face paled, then flushed with anger. "An Apache has been following us, watching us? Clara, they could have killed us in our sleep." He gripped her shoulders firmly. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" The irony of his question, demanding why she hadn't told him something when his understanding of her communication was so limited, was not lost on Clara. She pulled away, her own anger rising to match his, hands signing with deliberate slowness. "So he couldn't misunderstand. He helped us, gave medicine, showed water, knows what I am." "What you are," James echoed, his anger faltering into confusion. "You're my daughter, a girl who can't speak. What else is there to know?" Clara's hands stilled as she realized the gulf between them had never been wider. Her father, who loved her more completely, than anyone ever had, still saw her silence as merely an absence, a lack, a disability, a problem to be managed. He couldn't conceive that it might be the space within which another kind of hearing had developed. James misinterpreted her stillness as acquiescence. "We'll head for California," he said, his tone softening. "We'll find a place where no one knows us, where you won't be judged for being different." That night, as James slept, Clara made the most difficult decision of her young life. Taking only her small medicine pouch, a canteen of water, the stone bear, and a knife her father had given her for skinning rabbits, she slipped away from their camp. The waning moon provided just enough light to navigate the narrow defile leading out of the hidden canyon. As she emerged onto the open desert, Clara fought back tears. She was not abandoning her father out of anger or rebellion, but because their paths had diverged in ways he couldn't understand. His protection, while born of love, had become a constraint that would prevent her from discovering why she had been given her unusual abilities, why she could hear what others could not. A soft shuffling sound made her turn. The desert tortoise that had led them to water waited a few yards ahead, its ancient presence somehow reassuring rather than surprising. Beyond it, barely visible in the moonlight, stood the distinctive silhouette of Nahuel, as if he had known precisely when she would make this choice. "The daughter leaves the father," he signed as she approached. "A difficult path," Clara nodded, wiping away tears with dusty fingers. Her hands formed a question born of sudden doubt. "Will he be safe?" Nahuel considered this with appropriate seriousness. "I will ensure he finds right direction to White Man's Town. Leave sign he will understand." This small mercy eased Clara's most immediate worry. She made another sign, a simplified version of gratitude. "Why did you wait for me?" she asked. "How did you know I would come?" Nahuel's response was cryptic, his hands forming shapes that seemed part sign language, part ceremonial gesture. "The stone calls to what is already there, the ears that hear without sound, the voice that speaks without words." He pointed north and west toward the distant mountains. "My people face same drought, same dying land, need what you carry." As the first light of dawn painted the eastern horizon, Clara Emerson walked away from everything familiar, following an Apache medicine. Man into territory forbidden to settlers, guided by abilities she was only beginning to understand. Behind her, the hidden canyon cradled her sleeping father, who would wake to find his daughter gone and his world forever changed. What James Emerson couldn't know as he would read the carefully arranged stones Clara left as her farewell message was that his daughter had not abandoned him, but had instead answered a calling that transcended the boundaries of culture, language, and ordinary human perception. The gift that had made her an outcast among her own people was drawing her toward a destiny that would eventually transform not just her own life, but the fate of an entire region gripped by forces beyond human control. 7 days into their journey, toward the mountains, Clara's perception of the world had fundamentally transformed. Each morning began with Nahuel's patient instruction in a more complex form of sign language, one developed over centuries among various Apache bands to bridge spoken language barriers. Unlike the improvised gestures she had used with her father, this system contained subtle gradations of meaning, allowing her to express concepts that had remained trapped inside her silent mind for years. The physical journey was demanding, following ancient trails invisible to untrained eyes, crossing landscapes that shifted from parched desert to wind-sculpted badlands to the beginnings of juniper-studded highlands. But the interior journey Clara undertook proved even more profound. Nahuel's teaching extended beyond mere survival skills to a complete reorientation of how she experienced the natural world. "The stone bear awakens what sleeps inside you," he explained one evening as they camped beneath a massive sandstone arch. But Gift must be trained, like young eagle learning to hunt. Each day brought exercises that challenged Clara to extend her unusual sensitivity. Nahuel would bury small objects and ask her to locate them, not by sight, but by the subtle disturbances they created in the land's energy. He taught her to press her palms against different types of stone to distinguish their unique properties and histories. Most difficult were the sessions where he instructed her to close her eyes and identify which plants, among many similar ones, contained medicinal properties versus those that were ordinary. Other senses grow stronger when voice stays silent, Nahuel signed. This happened naturally for you. Now we strengthen purpose. Clara absorbed these lessons with an intensity that sometimes surprised even her teacher. The abilities that had emerged haphazardly throughout her childhood, her connection to plants, her awareness of hidden water, her intuitive understanding of animal behavior, were being systematically refined and expanded under Nahuel's guidance. On the 8th day, as they ascended a steep trail toward higher elevations, Clara stopped suddenly, her attention caught by something Nahuel couldn't perceive. She knelt, pressing her palm against a seemingly unremarkable patch of ground, her expression growing troubled. After a moment she looked up at Nahuel, her hands forming urgent signs. Something wrong here, underground, moving wrong. Nahuel studied her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to evaluate more than her words. What kind of wrong? Clara's. Hands struggled to articulate what her heightened senses detected, like sickness, but in the rock itself. Rather than dismissing her concern, Nahuel knelt beside her, placing his own hand where hers had been. After a long moment of concentration, he nodded slightly. You feel what many cannot. The earth's bones shift beneath us, building pressure. He pointed toward the distant mountains that had been their destination for days. More important now, we reach my people quickly. That evening, they made camp in a protected hollow beneath towering ponderosa pines, the first true forest Clara had encountered in her life. The cooler air and abundance of green life were almost intoxicating after years in drought-stricken Copper Canyon. As darkness fell, Nahuel built a small fire and prepared a tea from plants Clara had never seen before. Tonight, you learn story of Bear Clan, he explained as they sat before the fire. Why Stone Bear came to you, why drought came to our lands. Clara accepted the steaming wooden cup he offered, inhaling unfamiliar aromas that seemed to sharpen her awareness rather than dull it. As she sipped the bitter liquid, Nahuel's hands began to move in the firelight, their shadows dancing against the surrounding trees as he wove his tale. 3 generations passed. When my grandfather's grandfather was a boy, a great drought came. To these lands, longer and more terrible than any living memory. Many died, Apache, Navajo, even the ancient ones who built stone houses in canyon walls. Animals fled or perished, plants withered away. The tea's effect became more pronounced as Clara continued drinking. The flames seemed to trace patterns that echoed Nahuel's signing, and the surrounding forest's presence intensified in her awareness. Thousands of interlinked living organisms communicating in subtle ways, normally beyond human perception. In that time, Nahuel continued, there lived a man of our people, Sensei, first medicine man of Bear Clan. He went alone into sacred mountains to ask spirits why water had abandoned the people. For 12 days he fasted, prayed, listened. Clara found herself not merely understanding Nahuel's signed story, but experiencing fragments of it, the parched landscape, the desperation of thirst, the solitary figure on a mountaintop. The boundaries between past and present, between herself and the story, became permeable. On 13th day, Sensei received vision. Earth itself was changing, he learned. Not just rain's absence, but deeper movement in world beneath our feet. What flowed underground was changing course. Spirit of water was being redirected by Earth's shifting bones. The stone bear in Clara's pocket seemed to grow warm against her skin as Nahuel continued. Sensei was shown that certain people, rare ones, could hear these deep changes, could speak to the spirits of water, stone, plant, without using voice of air. Through these speakers without sound, balance might be restored, but only if tribes worked together instead of fighting. With deliberate movements, Nahuel reached toward Clara, gesturing for the stone bear. She placed it in his outstretched palm. Sensei carved this from stone, taken from sacred place where underground rivers meet, gave it power to help those who hear Earth's voice. For generations, medicine people of Bear Clan passed this stone to next who could hear, his dark eyes fixed meaningfully on Clara. But for 2 generations, no one among our people was born with gift strong enough. Clara's hands formed the obvious question. Why give it to me? I'm not Apache. Earth doesn't recognize boundaries drawn by men, Nahuel replied. Gift appears where needed. Stone calls to gift. He returned the carving to Clara, then continued his story, explaining how Sensei had established the Bear Clan as keepers of knowledge about the deep underground waterways that sustained life. In the region, networks of limestone caves and hidden rivers that connected disparate watersheds and springs. This knowledge had helped the people survive cycles of drought for generations, but knowledge fades when not renewed, Nahuel signed, his expression solemn. Old ones who remembered Sensei's teachings die. Young ones look to white man's ways. Now drought returns, worse than before, and with it the strange sickness in the rocks you felt today. The implications slowly crystallized in Clara's mind, her hands forming the question that arose from this understanding. You believe I can help restore the water, like Sensei did? Nahuel's response was both affirmation and caution. Stone Bear chose you, but path is dangerous. Many will not accept White Girl as bearer of such power. Others will fear what you can do. Some would use your gift for wrong purpose. The fire had burned low, its embers casting just enough light for their conversation to continue. Clara found herself at a crossroads that made her earlier decision to leave her father seem simple by comparison. What Nahuel described wasn't merely about finding water for a specific community, but potentially restoring balance to an entire region's hydrological system, a responsibility far beyond her 12 years of experience. I don't know if I'm strong enough, she signed honestly. No bearer of Stone Bear has ever felt strong enough, Nahuel replied. Power is never given to those who crave it. They reached the Bear Clan settlement shortly before noon the next day. Unlike Clara's expectations of a temporary Apache encampment, the clan's home was a permanent village nestled in a hidden valley between towering cliffs, with sturdy wooden structures supplementing the traditional wickiups. A small stream ran through the center, one of the few still flowing in the region according to Nahuel. Their arrival created an immediate stir. Children stopped their play to stare at the white girl accompanying their medicine man. Women paused in their work, expressions ranging from curiosity to outright suspicion. Several men moved forward with the cautious evaluation of potential threat. Nahuel raised his hand in a gesture that clearly requested patience and forbearance. He signed rapidly to an elderly man who seemed to hold authority, explaining Clara's presence and significance. Clara could follow only portions of this exchange, as they incorporated unfamiliar signs and moved too quickly for her developing comprehension. The elderly man, Tascano, chief of the Bear Clan, studied Clara with intensity that reminded her of Nahuel's evaluating gaze, though lacking its compassion. After a lengthy discussion that excluded her, the chief made a pronouncement that sent murmurs through the gathered clan members. He says you may stay, Nahuel translated for Clara, but must prove gift is real, not white man's trickery. Clara was given a small wiki-up at the village's edge, close enough to be watched, far enough to indicate her uncertain status. The clan's reaction to her presence split along predictable lines. Children, naturally curious, were the first to approach, though their mothers quickly pulled them away. Older members viewed her with open skepticism, while middle-aged adults maintained cautious distance. A few, primarily those involved in healing or spiritual practices, showed guarded interest. One unexpected ally emerged by evening. A young Apache woman named Nasha, perhaps 5 years older than Clara, who arrived at her wiki-up with a wooden bowl of stew and corn cakes. Unlike the others, she knew some sign language and made effort to communicate. "My grandfather was thrown from horse's young man," she explained through basic signs. "Could not speak after. We learned hand talk to understand him." This shared experience of communicating with someone who couldn't speak created an immediate bond between them. Nasha became Clara's guide to daily life in the Bear Clan settlement, showing her where to find water, how to use the unfamiliar, implements, and the complicated social protocols that governed the community. 3 days after Clara's arrival, Tascono announced the test that would determine her acceptance or rejection. The clan would hold council that night, where Clara would be asked to demonstrate her supposed abilities before the entire community. "What must I do?" Clara asked Nahuel anxiously as they walked along the stream that afternoon, preparing for the ordeal ahead. "Find what is hidden," he signed. "Show them you hear Earth's voice." "That's not very specific," Clara responded, frustration evident in her quick gestures. For the first time, Nahuel showed a glimpse of uncertainty. "I cannot prepare you more clearly. Challenge must be genuine. If you truly bear Sensei's gift, you will know how to respond when time comes." This vague reassurance did little to calm Clara's nerves as evening approached. She sat alone in her wiki-up, the stone bear clutched tightly in her palm, trying to quiet her mind enough to sense whatever guidance it might offer. But fear created static in her perception, like dust in the air, blocking clear vision. When Nasha came to escort her to the council fire, Clara felt woefully unprepared. The entire clan had gathered in a circular clearing, with Tascono and other elders seated. Prominently, Nahuel stood slightly apart, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts or expectations. Through Nahuel's translation, Tascono addressed Clara directly for the first time. "White child who cannot speak with tongue. Medicine man says you speak with other parts. That bare stone chose you." The chief's weathered face remained impassive. "We will see truth or lies tonight." An elderly woman, Lucia, the clan's most respected healer after Nahuel, stepped forward, carrying a large ceramic pot covered with a woven blanket. She placed it in the center of the gathering, then removed the covering to reveal that the pot was filled with soil. 12 objects buried, Tascono explained through Nahuel. "Find what does not belong to Earth." Clara approached the pot hesitantly, acutely aware of dozens of eyes evaluating her every movement. The test seemed straightforward enough. Locate hidden objects in soil, similar to exercises Nahuel had conducted during their journey. But something in the expectant silence of the gathering suggested complications beyond the obvious. Kneeling beside the pot, Clara closed her eyes and placed her hands on the soil's surface. Rather than immediately digging, as everyone clearly expected, she remained motionless, extending her awareness as Nahuel had taught her. The stone bear, now hanging from a leather cord around her neck, seemed to amplify her perception, helping her filter out distractions. Gradually, Clara began to distinguish anomalies within the soil, objects that interrupted the Earth's natural patterns. Metal created a particular disturbance, stone another, wood yet another. But as her awareness deepened, she realized with sudden clarity why Nahuel hadn't given more specific instructions. This wasn't merely a test of finding hidden objects. Her eyes snapped open, meeting Tascano's evaluating gaze directly, with deliberate movements. She signed, "There are 13 objects, not 12, and one is alive." A ripple of reaction moved through the gathering. Nahuel's expression remained neutral as he translated, but a subtle tension around his eyes relaxed slightly. Without waiting for confirmation, Clara began carefully removing soil from the pot. She worked methodically, setting aside each object she uncovered: an arrowhead, a silver coin, a carved shell, a copper bracelet. The assembled clan members watched in silence as the count reached 12, with every object now arranged on the ground beside the pot. Then, instead of continuing to dig, Clara placed her palm flat against the pot's side, closed her eyes once more, and waited. After several moments, she began gently tapping a complex rhythm against the ceramic surface with her fingertips. The clearing grew so quiet that even those at the furthest edges could hear the soft rhythmic pattern she created. Responding to this unexpected percussion, something moved within the remaining soil. A small snake, no longer than Clara's forearm and distinctive in its red and black banding, emerged from its concealment, slithering with apparent purpose toward Clara's still tapping fingers. Gasps arose from the gathering. This was no ordinary serpent, but a king snake, considered spiritually significant to the clan. More importantly, it was responding to Clara's communication as if to familiar speech. Clara allowed the snake to wind around her wrist, then stood and walked directly to an elderly man seated near Tascano. Without hesitation, she extended her arm, transferring the snake to the man's hands with gentle care. Nahuel stepped forward to explain what few in the clan had understood. The 13th object is not object at all, but messenger. Clara recognized not just its presence, but which elder it belongs to. Red Earth keeps this snake as his spirit guide since boyhood. It was test within test. Red Earth, the elderly man now cradling the snake, looked up at Clara with newfound respect. "How did you know he was mine?" he asked through Nahuel's translation. Clara's response was simple but profound. "He carries your song in his movement. I heard it in the soil." This demonstration, finding not just inanimate objects but recognizing the specific spiritual connection between animal and man, transcended what the clan had expected. Even Tascano's stern expression softened slightly as the implications registered. This was not a skill that could be learned or imitated. It represented exactly the kind of perception Sensei had described generations earlier. That night marked Clara's provisional acceptance into the Bear Clan, though many members remained wary of the white girl with inexplicable abilities. She was moved from the peripheral wickiup to a small dwelling closer to the center of the settlement, signifying her transition from outsider to someone under the clan's protection. More importantly, her formal training with Nahuel intensified, focusing now on specific techniques for understanding the deep movements of water beneath the Earth's surface. 3 weeks after the testing ceremony, as Clara sat with Nasha grinding corn near the stream, she felt a disturbance, a vibration so subtle that no one else noticed, but that sent ripples through her heightened awareness like a stone dropped in still water. She dropped the grinding stone, her hands instinctively reaching for the bear carving at her neck. Nasha looked up in alarm at her friend's sudden stillness. "What's wrong?" she signed. Clara couldn't immediately answer. The sensation defied easy description, like the feeling she had experienced on the trail with Nahuel, but magnified tenfold. Something fundamental was shifting deep below them, creating discordance in the patterns she had been learning to perceive. Without waiting to explain, she ran toward Nahuel's dwelling at the settlement's far edge. She found him already standing outside, his face grave, as he too sensed the disruption. Their eyes met in shared understanding before Clara's hands flew into urgent signs, Earth's bones breaking, water changing course, coming fast. Nahuel nodded once, confirming her perception. Earthquake preparing, but not ordinary movement, the sickness in stone spreading. Clara's hands formed the crucial question. How long? Days, perhaps hours. Must prepare people. His signs shifted to include another, more troubling implication. When Earth moves, underground rivers change. Spring that feeds our stream may disappear. The implications were immediate and catastrophic. Without the spring that supplied their water, the Bear Clan settlement would quickly become uninhabitable. Even more concerning was what Nahuel had been teaching Clara about the interconnected nature of the region's hydrology, how disruption in one underground system could cascade into others, potentially affecting water sources throughout the territory, including those feeding Copper Canyon. As Nahuel called the clan to emergency council, Clara's thoughts turned unexpectedly to her father. Where was James Emerson now? Had he continued to his brother's ranch or followed her trail? Was he safe? And would the coming disruption threaten whatever water sources sustained him? The questions swirled without answers as Clara found herself at another critical threshold, one where the gifts that had made her an outcast among her own people would now be tested against forces of nature that threatened not just the Apache, who had accepted her, but potentially everyone in the territory, including those who had rejected her. That evening, as the Bear Clan prepared for whatever upheaval approached, Clara sat alone at the stream's edge, the stone bear balanced on her, open palm. The carved figure seemed to pulse with subtle energy that matched the disturbed rhythms she now sensed in the earth below. Whatever purpose had brought her to this place, whatever destiny the bare stone had recognized in her, the moment of its fulfillment was approaching with the inevitability of an underground river finding its path through stone. Dawn broke over the Bear Clan settlement with an unnatural stillness. No birds sang their usual morning songs. The small animals that typically scurried through underbrush remained hidden in their burrows. Even the insects had fallen silent, as if the entire natural world held its breath in anticipation of what Clara and Nahuel had sensed approaching. The clan had spent the night in preparations guided by Nahuel's instructions, securing structures, gathering emergency supplies, moving elders and children to the most protected areas of the settlement. Now they waited, tense and watchful, for signs visible to ordinary senses of what Clara perceived through her heightened awareness. Clara sat cross-legged at the edge of the stream that sustained the settlement, her fingers trailing in the water. Over the past hours, subtle changes had manifested in the current, barely perceptible fluctuations in flow, minute alterations in temperature, and a nearly imperceptible cloudiness indicating disturbances at the source spring. Nasha approached, careful not to break Clara's concentration. When Clara finally looked up, Nasha's hands formed a simple question. "What do you hear?" Clara considered how to translate her perceptions into concepts Nasha would understand. "Water." "Afraid," she signed finally, seeking new paths beneath the ground. Nasha's expression reflected both skepticism and growing belief. Though she had befriended Clara out of kindness and shared experience with her mute grandfather, Nasha had maintained private doubts about the white girl's supposed powers. Now, witnessing Clara's communion with the stream and the mounting evidence of her predictions, those doubts were eroding. "Nahuel asks for you," Nasha signed, offering Clara a hand up from her position. Council gathering again. The Bear Clan's leadership had assembled in the central clearing. Tascano, the chief, Red Earth, the elder who had recognized Clara's gift with his snake, Lucia, the senior healer, and several other respected clan members. Their faces registered varying degrees of concern as Nahuel outlined what he and Clara had detected. "The disturbance grows stronger," Nahuel explained while Clara stood silently beside him. Not just earth movement, but sickness in the rock itself. When earthquake comes, it will change more than surface land. Underground rivers will find new courses. Tascono's weathered face remained impassive, though concern shadowed his eyes. How bad? How soon? Before Nahuel could answer, Clara stepped forward, her hands moving in the increasingly fluent Apache sign language she had mastered during her weeks with the clan. Before next sunset, she signed, her gestures emphatic. Stone Bear shows me. Pathways changing beneath mountains. Spring that feeds our stream will be blocked. Lucia, the elderly healer who had designed Clara's testing ceremony, leaned forward. Can damage be prevented? Clara and Nahuel exchanged glances, a silent communication born of their shared perceptions. Clara's hands formed careful signs in response. Cannot stop Earth's movement, but might redirect water underground before pathways fully change. Her gestures became more tentative, expressing concepts at the edge of her developing understanding, like guiding stream with stones before flood comes. Tascono turned to Nahuel, skepticism evident in his posture. Can this be done? Has clan medicine ever attempted such work? Not in living memory, Nahuel admitted. But clan stories tell of sensei doing similar during Great Drought, using Stone Bear to find where underground rivers could be guided. The chief's gaze returned to Clara, evaluating her with renewed intensity. And you believe this white child can do what no living Apache medicine person has attempted? Nahuel met the challenge without hesitation. Stone Bear chose her. Already her perception exceeds mine in some ways, stronger connection to water, as Sensei had. Clara felt the weight of expectation settle upon her like a physical burden. What Nahuel proposed went far beyond the exercises and training she had undergone. Using her gifts to sense water or find hidden objects was one thing. Actively intervening in the movement of underground waterways during an earthquake was something else entirely. An application of power she wasn't certain she possessed or understood. Her hands formed a question directed at Nahuel. How would this be done? Journey to spring source in sacred cave, he explained. Use Stone Bear where waters gather underground. Listen for pathways that remain stable after earth moves. Guide water there before old channels close. The impossibility of the task momentarily overwhelmed Clara. She was a 12-year-old girl who had lived most of her life on a struggling ranch in Copper Canyon. Despite her accelerated learning with Nahuel, despite the Stone Bear's amplification of her natural abilities, the responsibility seemed too vast to bear. As if sensing her doubt, Red Earth spoke up, his voice translated by Nahuel. When spirits choose unlikely vessel, they provide strength equal to task. Question is not capability, but willingness. Clara's hands stilled as she absorbed this wisdom. Perhaps she was approaching this wrong, focusing on her limitations rather than the gift she had been recognized as carrying. The Stone Bear had chosen her for reasons beyond her understanding, but that choice carried both responsibility and, presumably, the capacity to fulfill it. With deliberate movements, she signed her response. I am willing to try. For Bear Clan, for all who need water. Tascono studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Bear Clan will prepare ceremony to strengthen your journey. You leave when sun reaches highest point. As the council dispersed, Clara found herself momentarily alone with Nahuel. The medicine man's expression carried something she hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that humanized his usually stoic demeanor. There is risk, he signed, his movements unusually hesitant. Sacred Cave holds power beyond ordinary places. Stone Bear's influence grows stronger there. Some who enter are overwhelmed. Clara understood the subtext of his warning. The abilities she was developing could consume her if not properly channeled, especially in a place of concentrated natural power. She might succeed at redirecting the water, but lose herself in the process. "Why didn't you tell me this before the council?" she asked. Nahuel's response was both honest and burdened. "Bear Clan needs water to survive. Many will die without spring. As medicine man, must consider many lives against one." The stark calculus of survival laid bare. Clara nodded her understanding. Frontier existence had never allowed for comfortable illusions about life's fragility or the hard choices required by harsh circumstances. "I still choose to try," she signed, her movements now firm with resolve. The preparations for their journey to the sacred cave occupied the remaining morning hours. Lucia conducted a purification ceremony, burning sacred herbs and painting symbolic designs on Clara's forehead and palms with red ochre. Nasha helped her dress in appropriate Apache garments provided by the clan, explaining their significance and proper wearing. As midday approached, Clara found herself drawn once more to the stream, seeking a few moments of quiet communion before the challenging journey ahead. As she knelt by the water's edge, a flicker of movement on the opposite bank caught her attention. Something large had disturbed the underbrush, too large to be deer or coyote. Clara froze, her senses suddenly alert to potential threat. The bear. Clan settlement was well hidden, and Apache scouts patrolled the surrounding territory. Yet something or someone had approached near enough to observe the stream and potentially Clara herself. A familiar silhouette emerged partially from the concealing foliage, tall, broad-shouldered, with the distinctive hat that Clara would have recognized anywhere. Her heart lurched with shock and conflicting emotions. James Emerson, her father. For a moment that seemed suspended in time, they simply stared at each other across the narrow stream. The mute girl in Apache clothing, and the weathered cattleman who had crossed dangerous territory to find her. Then, with a decisive movement, James stepped fully into the open, his hands raised slightly to signal peaceful intentions to any watching Apache. "Clara," he called softly, her name carrying easily across the water. "Thank God you're alive." Clara stood, torn between joy at seeing her father and alarm at his presence in Bear Clan territory. How had he found her? What would the Apache do if they discovered him? The questions tumbled through her mind as she raised her hands urgently, gesturing for him to retreat into concealment. Instead, with typical frontier determination, James stepped into the shallow stream, clearly intending to cross. Panic flared in Clara as she realized what would happen if armed Apache scouts discovered a white man approaching their settlement uninvited. In desperation, she splashed into the water from her side, meeting her father midstream. Her hands flew in urgent gestures, trying to convey the danger and complexity of the situation. But James, overwhelmed by finding his daughter alive after weeks of searching, mistook her urgency for distress. "I'm taking you home, Clara," he said, reaching for her. "Whatever these people have told you, whatever they've done," Clara pulled back, shaking her head vehemently, her hands forming frantic explanations he couldn't possibly understand. The private sign language they had developed over years was inadequate for the situation's complexity, and James had never learned the Apache signs she now used fluently. The sound of movement behind her confirmed Clara's fears. 2 Apache scouts emerged from the trees on her side of the stream, bows ready but not yet drawn. James instinctively reached for the revolver at his hip, his expression hardening into the dangerous vigilance of a frontier settler confronting what he perceived as mortal threat. "Don't," he warned the scouts, his hand hovering near his weapon. "I'm just here for my daughter." The scouts, who understood some English from trading interactions, nonetheless advanced another step, their posture making clear that James was intruding on protected territory. The situation teetered on the edge of violence, with neither side willing to back down, and Clara caught literally in the middle. A sharp command in Apache halted the scouts. Nahuel emerged from the trees, his commanding presence immediately altering the confrontation's dynamics. He assessed the situation with one sweeping glance, then addressed James directly in accented but clear English. "James Emerson, you track well for white man, but very dangerous to come uninvited." James's eyes narrowed with suspicion and barely contained anger. "You know who I am, so you know I've come for my daughter." Clara moved to stand beside Nahuel, her hands forming urgent signs that the medicine man translated. "Clara says you must. Leave quickly. She is not prisoner, but earthquake comes soon, not safe." James's expression shifted between confusion and determination. "Earthquake? What are you talking about? Clara, whatever they've told you, she is here by choice." Nahuel interrupted. "As important work. Stone Bear chose her." The mention of the stone bear triggered recognition in James's eyes. "That carving. You gave it to her back at our ranch." His hand tensed again near his revolver. "You've been manipulating my daughter." From the beginning, Clara stepped forward, placing herself deliberately between her father and Nahuel. Her hands formed emphatic gestures directed at James, trying to make him understand without the complex Apache signs he couldn't follow. She pointed to herself, then made a drinking motion, then swept her hand to indicate the surrounding area. She touched the stone bear hanging from her neck, then mimicked the ground shaking. "Water," James interpreted haltingly. Something about water and shaking. His frontier-trained instincts finally registered what his parental concern had overlooked. The unnatural silence of the forest, the absence of wildlife, the subtle tension in the air that often preceded natural disaster. "You're serious about an earthquake?" Nahuel nodded. "Clara feels it coming, stronger than ordinary gift. She helps save water for many people. Apache, settlers, all need water." A distant rumble interrupted their standoff. Not thunder, but a deep vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The first perceptible tremor had arrived, validating Clara's warnings in a way no explanation could have achieved. James looked from the disturbed ground to his daughter's face, finally seeing what he had missed in Copper Canyon. Not a child, cursed with silence, but a young woman with extraordinary perception that transcended ordinary human limitations. "You really can sense these things," he said softly. "That's why you always knew when storms were coming, why animals responded to you differently, why plants thrived under your care." Clara nodded, relief washing over her as understanding finally dawned in her father's eyes. Another tremor, stronger than the first, rippled beneath their feet. Nahuel's expression grew urgent. "No more time. Must reach sacred cave before main earthquake." He addressed James directly. "You come with scouts to settlement. Stay until Earth stops moving, then decide." The unexpected inclusion, allowing a white man into the protected Bear Clan territory rather than sending him away, surprised both James and Clara. Nahuel's pragmatic decision acknowledged both the imminent natural danger and the complicated human factors at play. James would be safer with the clan than trying to leave during an earthquake, and his presence would ease Clara's divided attention during the critical task ahead. "What exactly is Clara going to do?" James asked, his protective instincts still strong, despite his new understanding. Nahuel's explanation was necessarily brief as the tremors continued to intensify. "Use gift to redirect underground river before earthquake blocks it. Save water, source for many people." The stark significance of this task silenced James's further questions. Whatever his doubts about Apache medicine or spiritual practices, the settlement's dependence on the spring was a practical reality he could understand, as was the threat an earthquake posed to water sources. He had seen wells go dry after smaller tremors on the frontier. "Be careful," he told Clara as the scouts led him toward the settlement. The simple phrase carried the weight of a parent's love, newly tempered by recognition of their child's autonomous purpose. Clara watched him go, a complex mixture of emotions washing through her. For years, she had longed for her father to truly see her, to recognize her silence, not as deficiency, but as the space within which her real gifts had developed. Now that recognition had come at the very moment she faced her greatest challenge. Time. "Grows short," Nahuel signed as soon as James had been escorted away. "We must reach cave before main shock." They set out immediately, following a steep trail that wound upward into the mountains behind the settlement. Clara could feel the tremors increasing in both frequency and intensity as they climbed. More disturbing were the changes she sensed in the water flowing beneath the surface. Erratic pulses and redirections as underground channels began to shift with the Earth's movement. The sacred cave's entrance was concealed behind a natural curtain of vegetation that Nahuel carefully moved aside. As they stepped from bright daylight into cool darkness, Clara felt an immediate shift in her awareness. The stone bare against her skin seemed to quicken with energy, resonating with something ancient and powerful within the cave itself. Nahuel lit a small torch of resinous pine, illuminating a passage that descended steeply into the mountain. The walls glistened with moisture, and the sound of water echoed from somewhere deep below. "Spring begins here," Nahuel explained, his signs visible in the flickering torchlight. "Comes from underground river, flowing through many chambers. Earthquake will collapse some passages, block water's path to settlement." They descended through increasingly narrow passages, the air growing dense with moisture and charged with something Clara could only describe as presence, a concentration of the same energy she had been learning to perceive in the natural world, but magnified to an almost overwhelming intensity. When they reached the lowest chamber, Clara understood why Nahuel had warned of the cave's power. A pool of crystalline water occupied the chamber's center, fed by a flowing stream that emerged from one rock wall and disappeared through another. But what made the space extraordinary wasn't its physical features, but the palpable sense of concentrated, natural force, as if the Earth's vital energy flowed through this junction as surely as the water itself. The stone bear at Clara's neck pulsed with responsive energy, no longer simply amplifying her awareness, but actively connecting her to the chamber's presence. She felt herself becoming both more and less than her ordinary self, her consciousness simultaneously expanding beyond her physical boundaries and merging with the larger patterns of earth and water. "Now we must work quickly," Nahuel signed, the urgency of his movements pulling Clara back to their immediate purpose. "Next big shock will change everything. Must find stable path for water before old way closes." Clara knelt beside the underground pool, the stone bear clutched in both hands. Following Nahuel's instructions and her own developing instincts, she closed her eyes and extended her awareness into the network of underground waterways. The stone bear served as both focus and conduit, helping her consciousness travel along the water's current, sensing the complex network of channels, crevices, and caverns that formed the region's hidden hydrological system. What she perceived was both wondrous and alarming, a vast interconnected web of waterways flowing through limestone labyrinths far beneath the surface. Some passages were ancient and stable, carved through stone over millennia. Others were newer, more tenuous. And throughout the system, she could feel the growing instability as seismic pressure built toward inevitable release. Most concerning was what she sensed along a specific flow channel, the one that carried water from this chamber to the spring that fed the Bear Clan settlement. Stress fractures were developing along its length, with several sections already partially blocked by fallen stone. When the main earthquake hit, this channel would almost certainly collapse completely. But that wasn't the worst of it. As Clara's awareness expanded further, following the water's many branching paths, she realized the coming earthquake would affect not just the Bear Clan's water supply, but a vast network of underground rivers that fed springs throughout the region, including those that sustained Copper Canyon, the implications stunned her. This wasn't merely about saving one Apache settlement, but potentially preserving water sources for everyone in the territory, both native peoples and settlers. If the underground rivers were blocked or diverted by the earthquake, springs and wells would dry up across the region, turning an already severe drought into an existential crisis. A violent tremor shook the chamber, dislodging small stones from the ceiling and causing the pool's surface to slosh against its rock boundaries. Nuguil steadied himself against the wall, his expression growing more urgent as he signed to Clara. "Main shock comes soon. Must act now." Guided by instinct and the stone bear's influence, Clara placed both hands into the pool, allowing her awareness to merge more completely with the water's flow. She could sense multiple potential pathways, alternative channels that could carry the water if properly connected before the existing route collapsed. What happened next transcended ordinary experience. Through some combination of the stone bear's power, her own developing gifts, and the sacred cave's concentrated energy, Clara found herself able to influence the water's behavior in subtle but significant ways. Not controlling it, water could never truly be controlled, but communicating with it, suggesting rather than commanding. She sensed the water's essential nature as responsive rather than passive, a conscious participant in the Earth's cycles rather than merely a resource flowing through rock. Using the stone bear as intermediary, Clara conveyed understanding of the coming disruption and offered alternative pathways that would preserve the water's journey to the surface while avoiding the channels most vulnerable to collapse. The communion required no words, occurring instead through an exchange of sensation, intention, and shared purpose. Water, she discovered, had its own form of awareness, not human consciousness, but something more fluid and interconnected, inherently responsive to the larger patterns of Earth's cycles. Another violent tremor shook the chamber, larger than any previous. Small fragments of rock rained down from the ceiling, splashing into the pool and narrowly missing Clara and Nahuel. The main earthquake was beginning. Clara remained in deep communion with the water and stone, her physical body seemingly forgotten as her awareness rode the currents through the mountain's heart. She could feel the existing channels collapsing, as predicted, but also sensed the water finding the alternative pathways she had helped establish, flowing around obstructions, seeping through minute cracks to connect with larger channels, following the path of least resistance toward the surface springs that sustained life above. As the most violent shaking subsided, Clara gradually returned to ordinary awareness, her consciousness contracting back into the boundaries of her physical form. She opened her eyes to find Nahuel watching her with an expression of wonder rarely seen on his stoic face. "It is done," he signed. Clara nodded, exhaustion washing over her as the stone bear's extraordinary energy receded to more manageable levels. Her hands formed simple signs, limited by her depleted strength. Water finds new path. Spring will continue, but changed. Another realization came to her as her ordinary thinking reasserted itself. Must return to settlement. Tell them water's path changes. Spring will appear in different place. Nahuel nodded, helping her to her feet. "You have done what Sensei himself might have done. Bear Clan will remember for generations." As they made their way carefully back through the shaken passages of the sacred cave, Clara carried not only physical exhaustion, but a profound shift in understanding. The communion with water had revealed something about the nature of her gift that went beyond Nahuel's teachings or her own previous experiences. Her silence, the characteristic that had marked her as cursed in Copper Canyon, had never been merely an absence of speech, but the necessary condition for a different kind of dialogue. In the space where spoken language might have developed, another channel of communication had opened instead, one that allowed her to hear and eventually converse with aspects of the natural world that most humans had forgotten how to perceive. Emerging from the cave into late afternoon sunlight, Clara and Nahuel found a transformed landscape. Trees had fallen, rock slides scarred the mountainside, and dust still hung in the air from disturbed earth. The path back to the settlement had been partially blocked by debris, forcing them to find alternative routes. As they navigated this changed terrain, Clara's thoughts turned to her father waiting in the Bear Clan settlement and to Copper Canyon beyond. The work she had begun in the sacred cave was only a first step. Preserving water sources throughout the region would require ongoing attention as the earth continued settling in the earthquake's aftermath. For the first time since leaving her father's ranch, Clara could glimpse the outlines of her future path. Neither fully Apache nor white settler, but something new that incorporated elements of both worlds while serving the land they shared. The stone bear had indeed chosen her for a purpose larger than she had imagined, one that might eventually bridge the divide between peoples as surely as it had helped her redirect water through stone. 3 months after the earthquake that changed the landscape of the Arizona Territory, Clara Emerson stood on the ridge overlooking Copper Canyon. The town below appeared smaller than she remembered, its buildings weathered by drought and hardship, yet signs of resilience were evident even from this distance. Repairs to damaged structures, gardens showing hints of green despite the continuing water scarcity, people moving with purpose rather than desperation. Beside her stood Nahuel, who had accompanied her on this journey back to the place that had once rejected her. Behind them waited James Emerson and 2 Apache scouts from the Bear Clan, maintaining a respectful distance, while Clara gathered her thoughts. "Are you ready?" Nahuel signed, his movements carrying the subtle grace that reflected his status as medicine man. Clara nodded, her hands forming a response that revealed how much she had grown in confidence and expression since leaving Copper Canyon. "They may not welcome what I bring, but they need to understand what's happening beneath their feet." The earthquake had indeed redirected underground waterways throughout the region, just as Clara had sensed in the sacred cave. While her work had preserved the Bear Clan's water source, emerging in a new location but flowing strong, other communities had not fared as well. Reports filtering through trading networks and military outposts told of wells running dry across the territory, springs disappearing overnight, and entire settlements abandoned due to water loss. Copper Canyon had suffered as well. The town well had diminished to a trickle, and the small creek that had supplemented their water needs had dried up completely 2 weeks after the earthquake. They now survived by hauling water from a distant river, an arduous and insufficient solution that would become impossible when winter made the trails impassable. What Clara and Nahuel had discovered, through careful exploration using her heightened senses, was that a new underground channel had formed, one that could potentially restore Copper Canyon's water if properly accessed. The knowledge was useless, however, unless the town would listen to the silent girl they had driven away and the Apache medicine man they would instinctively distrust. This was why James Emerson's presence had become so crucial. Over the previous months, as he witnessed Clara's work with the Bear Clan and came to understand the true nature of her abilities, James had transformed from skeptic to advocate. Now he would serve as the essential bridge between worlds, speaking for Clara when signs wouldn't suffice, lending his credibility as a respected settler to her extraordinary perceptions. "They'll listen," James assured Clara, reading the concern on her face. "They're desperate enough to try anything, even trusting an Apache medicine man and a girl they once called cursed." Clara smiled at her father's blunt assessment. Their relationship had evolved into something deeper than the protective bond of their earlier years. James now saw her clearly, not as a child to be sheltered, but as a young woman with gifts that transcended ordinary understanding. The pride in his eyes, whenever he witnessed her work with the stone bear, had healed wounds in Clara's heart that she hadn't fully acknowledged. They descended toward Copper Canyon as afternoon shadows lengthened across the landscape. Their arrival created an immediate stir. Children stopped their play to stare at the unusual procession, a known rancher returning with his missing daughter, now dressed in a blend of settler and Apache clothing, accompanied by an Apache medicine man and scouts. Women paused in hanging laundry on clotheslines. Men stepped out of the general store, and Reverend Stanley emerged from the church with an expression of stunned disbelief. Mayor Thornton, who had led the council that effectively banished Clara, approached their party with obvious caution, his hand resting near the pistol at his hip. "James Emerson," he acknowledged stiffly, "didn't expect to see you back in these parts." His gaze shifted to Clara, recognition dawning. "And the girl. Thought you were taking her to your brother's place up north." "Plans changed," James replied, evenly. "Clara has something this town needs, something more valuable than silver or gold in times like these." "And what might that be?" Thornton asked, his tone skeptical despite the obvious desperation visible throughout the town. Empty water barrels lining porches, withered gardens, the gaunt faces of residents who had been rationing water for months. "Knowledge of where water flows beneath the ground," James answered. "Knowledge of how to reach it before your town dries up completely." A murmur ran through the gathering crowd. Thornton's expression wavered between suspicion and reluctant interest. "And these Apache, they're part of this knowledge." Clara stepped forward, her hands forming signs that her father translated. "Nahuel is medicine man of the Bear clan. He helped me develop the gift you once feared. Together, we can locate where new water channels formed after the earthquake." Reverend Stanley pushed through the crowd, his thin face flushed with emotion. "This is outrageous. The girl was sent away because her presence brought misfortune. Now, she returns with heathens, claiming magical powers over water." James Emerson's hand moved toward his own weapon, but Clara placed a restraining hand on his arm. Her serene expression contrasted sharply with the Reverend's agitation as her hands formed calm, deliberate signs. "Not magic. Listening." James translated, "The stone bear helps me hear what moves beneath the surface. The same gift that saved the Bear clan's water source can save Copper Canyon." Martha Wilson, who had once been among Clara's most vocal detractors, pushed forward through the crowd. The drought's toll was evident in her hollowed cheeks and the desperate hope that overcame her previous prejudice. "Is it true? Can you really find water?" Clara nodded, then signed directly to the woman, knowing her father would translate. "The earthquake that shook these mountains redirected underground rivers. Your well dried because its source was blocked, but new channels have formed. One passes directly beneath the eastern edge of town, deep but reachable." Mayor Thornton's pragmatic nature finally overcame his suspicion. "Prove it," he challenged. "Show us something that demonstrates this ability." Clara exchanged glances with Nahuel, who nodded slightly, giving permission for a demonstration they had discussed during their journey. With deliberate movements, Clara approached the town's central well, the one that had dwindled to a mere trickle after the earthquake. Kneeling beside the well's stone edge, she removed the stone bear from around her neck and held it over the dark opening below. The gathered townspeople watched with mixtures of skepticism, hope, and unease as the strange girl they had banished performed what appeared to be some form of ritual. What they couldn't perceive was what Clara experienced. Through her connection with the stone bear, the complex network of underground passages spreading beneath their feet like the veins of a living entity. She could sense the blockage that had diverted water from the well, feel the new channels that had formed, and identify precisely where they ran deepest and strongest. Rising from her position, Clara walked with unwavering confidence through the crowd and out to the eastern edge of town. The townspeople followed at a cautious distance, their curiosity overcoming reservations. When she stopped in a seemingly unremarkable patch of ground near the abandoned Peterson homestead, her hands formed signs that James translated for the gathering. "Here, the new water channel runs 30 feet below this spot, stronger than your old well ever was, will not fail even in drought years if properly accessed." Thornton crossed his arms skeptically. "That's Peterson land, been abandoned since the family moved on after losing their cattle last winter. The water doesn't recognize human boundaries." Nowell spoke suddenly, his accented English surprising those who assumed he couldn't communicate directly. "It flows where earth allows, not where men decide." This simple truth, spoken by an Apache, to settlers who considered the concept of land ownership fundamental, created a moment of unexpected understanding. Several of the townspeople nodded despite themselves, recognizing the wisdom in the statement. Samuel Tucker, who had once run the now-shuttered assay office, stepped forward. As the town's most knowledgeable resident regarding mining and drilling, his opinion carried weight. "If what the girl claims is true, we could sink a new well here, but it would require significant labor and materials we can barely spare." Clara's hands moved again, James translating. "The Bear clan will help. They have experience finding and accessing deep water sources, in exchange for permission to use the water themselves during seasonal hunting journeys." The proposition, cooperation, between settlers and Apache rather than conflict, was so unexpected that it momentarily silenced even Reverend Stanley's objections. Mayor Thornton, ever the practical leader, recognized the potential value despite his ingrained prejudices. If, and I stress if, this water exists as claimed, sharing access would be negotiable, he conceded reluctantly. Clara nodded, then made one more series of signs that her father translated with evident pride. "I will remain to help locate the exact drilling point and ensure the underground channel isn't damaged during digging. The stone bear shows paths that should be followed, and those that should be avoided." In that moment, standing before the community that had rejected her, Clara Emerson embodied something entirely new in the Arizona territory. Neither fully of the settler culture that had borne her, nor of the Apache world that had recognized her gifts, but a bridge between worlds that had previously existed in separation and often hostility. The work began the following day. Under Clara's guidance, interpreted through both her father and Nowell, the exact drilling location was marked, and excavation commenced. Men from Copper Canyon worked alongside Apache from the Bear clan, their common need for water temporarily overcoming generations of mistrust. Clara moved between these groups with natural grace, her silence no longer a barrier, but almost an advantage, allowing her to communicate with both sides without the baggage of spoken words that so often carried unintended offense or misunderstanding. Her gestures and expressions, supplemented by the more formal sign languages she had mastered, created a shared vocabulary of purpose that transcended cultural differences. 2 weeks into the well-digging operation, when the diggers were approaching, the depth Clara had specified, she felt a distinct change through her connection with the stone bear. Rushing to the excavation site, she signaled for work to stop immediately. The diggers, who had learned to trust her seemingly inexplicable awareness, withdrew from the hole as directed. Hours later, water began seeping into the bottom of the excavation, slowly at first, then with increasing force. By morning, they had to install pumps to prevent flooding as they completed the well structure. The underground channel Clara had sensed was precisely where she had indicated, and more abundant than anyone had dared hope. The day the new well officially opened, producing more water in an hour than the Old Town well had provided in a week, a remarkable gathering took place in Copper Canyon. Settlers and Apache shared a meal in the town square, not as formal allies, certainly not as friends, but as people acknowledging a common dependence on the land's resources and the value of cooperation over conflict. Mayor Thornton approached Clara during this celebration, his previous condemnation replaced by grudging respect. "The council has voted," he informed her, with James and Nahuel standing protectively nearby. "You and your father are welcome to reclaim your ranch if you wish. The back taxes have been waived in recognition of—" He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. With acknowledging concepts that challenged his worldview, services rendered to the town. Clara's hands formed a response that James translated with a hint of amusement. "We thank the council for their generous offer, but Clara's work extends beyond Copper Canyon now. Other communities, both settler and native, face similar water challenges after the earthquake. Indeed, word of Clara's remarkable abilities had spread throughout the territory. 3 other settlements had already sent representatives requesting her assistance in locating new water sources. 2 Apache bands beyond the Bear Clan had approached Nahuel about the speaker without sound, who could communicate with underground rivers. As twilight settled over the impromptu celebration, Clara slipped away to the ridge overlooking the town. The stone bear in her palm pulsed with gentle warmth, its connection to her now so natural it felt like an extension of her own senses. Through it, she could perceive the complex network of waterways flowing beneath the visible landscape, a hidden geography that sustained life above but remained unknown to most. Nahuel joined her on the ridge, his presence as quiet and contained as her own. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the intermingled groups of settlers and Apache below, still separate in many ways, still cautious, but sharing the same physical space without conflict, united by the fundamental need for water. "You have become what Sensei foresaw," Nahuel signed eventually, "one who speaks between worlds, between people, between Earth and those who live upon it." Clara considered this assessment, her fingers tracing the contours of the stone bear that had set her on this unexpected path. Her response, when it came, reflected both humility and growing certainty about her purpose. "The drought came because people forgot how to listen," she signed, echoing what Nahuel had told her months earlier, not just to each other, but to the land itself. "Perhaps that's what silence has prepared me for all along, to hear what others had forgotten and to help them remember." As darkness enveloped the land, Clara Emerson stood poised between worlds. The silent girl once cast out as cursed, now recognized as bearer of a precious gift. Her journey had transformed not just her own life, but the understanding of an entire community. And as the underground rivers continued their hidden flow beneath the surface, reshaping channels in response to the Earth's movements, Clara's own path continued to form, connecting worlds that had long existed in separation, bridging differences. Through the universal need for life's most basic element, the silence that had once marked her as different had become her greatest strength, the space within which she had learned to hear the Earth's whispers and translate them for those who had forgotten how to listen. In a territory where words often divided, Clara's wordless understanding built connections that transcended the boundaries of language, culture, and belief, flowing like water around obstacles to find the path of greatest harmony. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.